So let's talk about events. So there are basically three types of events: application events, phase events, and system and component system events. So let's consider the first category, application events. So application events are directly related to application. So let's consider action event. Now we have already seen the action event. When we have the action attribute or the action listener attribute on any of your command controls, the action event gets fired. So over here, I'm pointing this to save animal, and the method is over here, and the action listener is pointing to some action which is over here. The main difference between action and action listener is action can take us to a different page, whereas action listener always stays on the same page. So over here we went to the show page because this is bound to the action method, and for the action listener we go to this action, and the return type is void, so we always remain on the same page. Also, the action listener method takes an action event argument, and the action methods are executed in this phase. First, the action listener is executed, and then the action method is executed. And so, if I run this example, and when I click the submit button and we do not have any validation errors, then the output is this: some action and animal saved. So action listener gets executed first, and then the action method gets executed. Let's consider the next event, value change event. Value change event occurs when the value of an input component changes. For example, let's say we want to check when the value of this component changes. So here I can assign a listener, value change listener. So like this, instead of action and action listener, we can have a value change listener to listen to value change events of input components. So over here, animal bean dot, and I've already written the method, my value changed. And here is that method. It takes the argument of value change event, and it occurs when the value of this component changes. And in the life cycle, the value change event occur after this phase. Perform validation, they are fired after this phase, whereas action and action listener methods are fired in this phase. So I removed the required is equal to true for both so that we don't get validation errors. Let's save and run this application. So let's press this button, and here's the output. So the value changed event occurred before the action listeners because it occurs after this phase. So let's consider the next kind of event, which is phase events. So phase events occur before and after each phase. So it will occur here, 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 here. It occurs between the phases. So for registering the phase event, we do not register it directly on the components. Instead of that, we register it in the phases config file, which is over here. So using the phase listener tag, we are going to register the listener. So our listener is this. So let's see this class. So our phase listener is supposed to implement phase listener interface, and this interface has three methods. The last method says that we are interested in listening to all the phases. For example, we can listen to individual phase, or we can listen for all phases. Here, instead of any phase, I can mention that we can mention individual phase. So if we mention an individual phase, it will listen only for that phase. Right now we are interested in listening for all the phases. The before phase method runs before a phase, and after phase method runs after a phase. So let's see this in action. So let's run the application. And here is our open page. Now if we go to the server log, you will see that the method is run, the before phase method is run, and then after phase method is run. Same for this. Render response and render response, before render response and after render response. So as I mentioned before, when you just ask for the page for the first time, we go to this phase and directly go to the render response phase. So you can see that over here. So let me clear this first, and then let's submit the page, and let's see the server log. So as you can see, all the phases have run. The restore view phase, apply request values, process validations, update model values, invoke application, and then render response. Now let's make one change to the application. Let's add some validation, required true, and let's save and run the application. So the index page is open. Let's see the server log, and you can see only the first and last phase have run, restore view and render response. Now let's submit the page. And if you see, all the phases have run, but there is a validation error. So after validation, we directly went to render response phase. So when there is any validation error, we directly go over here. These phases are not invoked. And since if there are any validation error, we directly go to this phase, our model doesn't get corrupted. Our beans don't get corrupted with wrong values. Neither do we invoke any action when the values are wrong. Now let's consider the last group of events, which is system and component system events. So these events occur at a much more fine-grained level than this event. So our phases event occur at the beginning and end of the phases, but our system and component system events occur at different levels within the life cycle as well as after and before the life cycle. So let's see an example of component system event. So we'll consider this pre-render component event. So the pre-render component event occurs just before a component gets rendered. So in our case, let's say HTML input text is going to render this input type is equal to text. So if we register a pre-render component event for this, so just before rendering this, that event gets fired. So I already created one example. So what we have here is 3 output text tags. And for each tag, we have registered that event, pre-render component event. So before this output text renders, this event is going to run. Just before it's going to render. So in this phase, just before it renders, we are going to have that event fired. In our case, it's output text component. So I registered the same listener for all the 3 components. So let's see this listener. So as you can see, it accepts an argument of type component system event. What this method does is, first from the argument we get the component. So the component in our case can be this, this or this. So after getting the component, we get the value out of that component using getValue method, and then we convert that value into an int. If the value is equal to 50, we set the style of that component with the color red. So right now this has a value of 50, so this should go red. And when we run this example, here's the output. So this is red. Just to show you what is rendered, let's view the page source. And as you can see, the middle output text has style color red.